Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today on Wednesday to talk about cyber resilience in 2022. Cyber insurance has quickly become a hot topic affecting every single organization. Where this was once a healthcare-related industry, risk to be mindful of, it's quickly permeated its way into nearly every organization's risk factors and operating concerns, and for good reason. More and more in today's world, we depend on technology. It touches every part of our lives in the ways that we communicate with our customers, the way that we interface with our employees, and more importantly, the way that we access data. And data has become king in our world. Today, we're going to spend some time digging into what it takes to get a competitive quote for your cyber insurance in 2022, what you as an organization can do today to implement effective controls that can actually improve your position to survive a ransomware event and focus on controlling the costs associated with this ever-growing risk, as well as continuity planning and testing the resilience of your organization before an event occurs. We never want to be in a reactive position, and when we are, we know the costs are going to escalate, and we know that we're going to be facing unseen, unexpected results. It's important for us to plan on what can happen to our organization and which partners we can rely on in the event that we do have a disaster to recover from. And more importantly, if we take the steps to be proactive, what type of savings we can generate and how we can anticipate that next wave of threats. Our agenda today will cover a basic overview of the insurance marketplace, what is going into getting an application completed in 2022, the additional information that you may be requested to provide through these applications, as well as the owner's response of assuming some additional risk, because the insurance marketplace just simply can't support the massive amount of loss that it's experienced. We're working with our trusted partner at Wulf Consulting. Lawrence will go over 3 steps you can implement today that will give you an improved position to respond and stave off an attack. The steps you can take working with your broker to secure the best coverage and pricing, because the pricing itself has gone up, but the coverage has also been affected. Limited coverage terms, reduced capacity, as well as increased responsibilities on the insured. And lastly, why just securing a policy isn't going to be enough. We have to plan for the worst. We have to have continuity planning in place to ensure that when this does happen, it's a minor interruption rather than a life-defining event for our business. The cyber insurance marketplace, more than any other line of coverage, continues to go through a dynamic life cycle, where typically insurers grow and understand a risk and can effectively price that. The cyber insurance marketplace continues to experience ups and downs. The amount of losses that occur have continued to mount, and as insurers are trying to protect their investments and, more importantly, get ahead of that next wave of threats, they simply haven't been effective at doing that. The typical response when an insurance product or a type of claim continues to increase is, we'll see the rates increase. Well, it's going to cost more to insure this, and so we'll just jack up the premiums. That in itself hasn't alleviated this problem. More people are relying on cyber insurance, which now limits the amount of capacity that's out there. As insurers have experienced increased losses, they've felt less comfortable offering renewal terms to insureds for the same amount. $10 million in coverage last year, and the same client may only be afforded $5 million for the same price that they were paying. So we've seen that the increase in rates and the premium simply hasn't alleviated the problem. And this is largely based because the clients, the insureds, haven't adopted a change in their approach. They haven't taken a good hard look at their own personal habits, the risk factors of their organization, and seen that they have responsibility in preventing these claims. A cyber liability policy by itself will not restore your business back to a pre-event state. It simply won't. It's going to take much more planning on the organization's part, and it's going to take a village, a network of people to help support getting you back up and running. But what we have learned over the last year is that regardless of the industry that you're in, cyber is the #1 concern for all businesses. And what started as a healthcare issue, as I mentioned before, largely because of private information or personally identifiable information, like healthcare records, most people were focused on the data breach. What type of information do I have that would be valuable to someone else? And oftentimes, people convinced themselves that they weren't a target. I don't really have valuable information. I don't have sensitive data or records that someone would want to buy. But we quickly saw that it wasn't just about a data breach. It was about how important data was to you, what you would pay to get it back to restore your organization to its operating capacity. So without being a high-level target, a government office or a healthcare organization or a payment card processing industry, many clients have had a false sense of security that they're simply not a target. And that's not the case. Every business is a target for email compromise, for phishing and spoofing attempts, as well as for a ransomware event that's ultimately meant to disrupt your business. You cannot approach 22 or 23 or 24 with the same methodology and risk practice that you had yesterday. The threats are evolving way too quickly, and it's becoming more difficult for organizations to stay ahead of these things. In a simple term, there's no other way to describe it. The cyber liability marketplace is like a dumpster fire, and it's raging. And it's incumbent upon us as your broker and as a client to take more steps to take aggressive measures to prevent that next wave of cyber attacks. So while we've seen the losses mount, there is much more happening in the world that's creating additional uncertainty in the marketplace. We can't ignore the fact that the Ukraine-Russian conflict, verging on war, will have implications. And we saw that the last round of the Ukraine and Russia conflict brought another wave of ransomware malware that came out ultimately to attack one area. But the way that the internet is connected, it spreads and it spreads and it spreads. And it creates uncertainty for businesses. Will they have coverage? Should these ransomware attempts, should a cyber attack be related to a war where there's a war exclusion? And literally the ground is moving under our feet. We are rapidly understanding the changing dynamics, what could happen in the event that there is a classified war, and ultimately the fact that most cyber insurance policies still have a cyber terrorism component that would bring that coverage back into play. But what happens today is still very different than what we may see 6 months from now as this war develops. As the marketplace has responded and quite honestly reacted to what continues to be a losing situation, there is much more scrutiny on customers as they look to procure cyber insurance. And when we talk about scrutiny, we're talking about invasive questioning. We're looking at what you've done to stave off these attempts. What type of attacks have you experienced in the past, as well as what type of methods have you put in place since those attacks to ensure that you can recover quickly? What controls do you have in place to be actively managing and preventing an attempt of access to your systems? What information do you have that is deemed sensitive or vital, and how are you protecting those? A common term that came up through these last 2 years of insurance renewal cycles has been multi-factor authentication, MFA. And what has once become a gold standard and a heightened risk control is now simply table stakes. It's basic requirements in order to secure a cyber insurance policy. So as we've seen this market really tighten up, it's become more important that organizations realize they can't necessarily handle this all under roof. They can't do it within their organization, and they need additional help. Which is why I asked Lawrence to join us today from Wulf Consulting. As we continue to see this wave of attacks change, it's become challenging for businesses to stay ahead of this wave of threats. We do patch management, another one comes out, and it becomes a game of reaction. And because we are still reacting, and that is a form of our controls, is to react to what that last and most recent wave of attacks are, we know that it's just simply not in our business DNA to do this. We need help. And in order to do that, we have to rely on trusted partners. So as Lawrence and I worked through the mechanics of this presentation, we wanted to bring some information to the table. We wanted to create this more about than just getting a good price on your insurance, but how can you prevent an attack? What do you need to know as a business owner, as a manager, as a leader within your organization to take an active role and have an eyes wide open approach to know what you're up against? And so we wanted to start with a pop quiz. So in the chat box, please enter what your thoughts are, but what percentage of email intrusion incidents happen because of weak or stolen passwords? I'll give you a few seconds to type your response. These are good answers. These are good answers. So in actuality, it's 80%. That number is significant. That's a number that we should be able to get a hold of and take a big bite out of simply by making a minor investment in the way that we do our business. And before I steal any more of his thunder, I want to introduce Lawrence Henriksen from Wulf Consulting, a trusted partner of Seubert. We've been working with him for 20 years, and Lawrence has been in the business for 22. And he's certainly seen this, evolution of cybersecurity, business IT, and ultimately where a managed service provider, plays into that ecosystem with, managing this wave of cyber threats. Lawrence?
Thanks for the warm introduction, Joe. Sorry for such a scary topic. Everybody hates fear, uncertainty, and doubt, but it seems like that's all we talk about these days. So when I was doing the research for this webinar, I found 6 things you can do to prevent ransomware, 18 things, 100 things. I don't think there's a limit on the number of things, but at least these things will get you started down the right path. And the first thing, I'm sure anybody in the insurance industry would agree, is that you can't protect what you don't know. So we have to assess what you have. Same as you'd have to provide a list of employees, a list of vehicles, what kind of coverages you're looking for. We need to know what software you use. Is that Salesforce? Is that Sage? Is that Dynamics? And think cloud, not just your on-premise. Did you know that you still need to back up Office 365? A lot of people think when they move to the cloud that their responsibility ends for maintaining infrastructure. While the hardware part is true, the responsibility for the data is still paramount. And then on top of that, you've got to have a plan. If we don't have a plan, your chance of survival is greatly reduced. Businesses that have a disaster recovery plan, incident response plan, and I hear all these words, right? There's business continuity, crisis management. You can call it what you want. Let's just call it a plan. If you have one, your chances of surviving an attack of any kind, whether it be breach, ransomware, or the most common, just human error, we still screw up. Once we have those things, backing up is the silver bullet. That is still, Joe mentioned table stakes and gold standards. Without good backups, you will not be able to recover. You will just lose data, lose capabilities, and be unable to do business. So making sure those backups are ironclad and meet today's requirements are critical. Backups used to be syncing to an external hard drive, but today your data lives everywhere. With the current state of the world, you may have half your people working from home. Where is all of your data? Is it in a cloud infrastructure? Is it at your office? Is it at your data center? Making sure to properly back that up. And I don't know if anybody's heard the new buzzword, but immutable is the word of the day for backup. What that means is that backup can't be written or changed. So should you be attacked by ransomware, malware, or human error, those backups will be recoverable. And then you've got to fall back to that plan, right? So I don't know about how many of you have filled out a ransomware addendum or any kind of insurance paperwork, but I would say 5 years ago, it consisted of 5 questions. Today, you're going to see pages and pages asking about encryption, authentication mechanisms, who has access to data, and they're going to get super specific on what types of software and what types of protections you have in place. Do you have Sophos? Do you have McAfee? Do you have Fortinet? And they ask these specific questions because of problems with the industry, right? It leapfrogs. Every day there's a new leader. So that's going to come back to haunt us at one point. Multi-factor authentication. This is the single best technical thing you can do. And if you've been paying attention to the news recently, there were a couple of big breaches, Microsoft, Okta. These breaches bypassed MFA. So we've had a lot of clients asking us, well, what good is MFA? Why are we going to bother to implement it if it doesn't work? And the answer is it does work. It has to go hand in hand with employee training. The way they preached it is basically through employees. They just kept hitting the employees until somebody hit accept. Somebody wanted to stop the noise. So MFA does work. And our other answer to that question is just because I can smash your door lock doesn't mean you stop locking your door, right? MFA is the best practice today that results in the best protection for your organization. Mind you, this has to be across all your critical systems. This can't be one thing. So the best place to start is email. If you don't have it on your email, they will likely get access to many of your other systems because they can reset passwords and laterally move by doing so. So that multi-factor authentication can take many forms. It can be an app on your phone. It can be a physical device. It can be a text message. And yes, there are better ways. The device is the ultimate. The app is the next best. And the text message is the least secure. But all of them are better than doing nothing. So, and lastly, awareness. We all need to, this is a moving target. We need to be educating ourselves, be watching the news, be reading up on things on a regular basis. So,
now, Lawrence,
yeah, go ahead, Jim.
Awareness is one of those topics. It's like common sense, right? We believe that people should know. So when we talk about that, I mean, it's hard to believe that anyone hasn't heard about a cyber event. They haven't heard about being hacked. They haven't heard about, a data breach. Do you find that there's still a gap in awareness on, the steps businesses need to take, and more importantly, at the employee level, what their responsibilities are to, do their part to prevent that next ransomware?
There certainly is. And the most common one is that we're not a target. You mentioned it earlier. They think we're too small. Well, you're not. Everyone is a target. When you put a system on the internet, it'll be seconds before it's attacked. Will you notice it? Will it succeed? Will it have any benefit or detriment? Probably not, but you will be attacked almost immediately. So there's definitely a lack of awareness that you are a target. That's the first thing. And then secondly, that things change. We tell people not to open bad emails or not to click links, but now we're getting spoofed texts. We're getting different types of attacks, browser windows. So that awareness has to be an ongoing thing. It's not something that we can train people on once and say they've got it, or that we can expect new employees to already know, right? This is an ever evolving threat. So,
and you're exactly right about the misguided information on, am I a target or not? And we're finding that the type of attacks that organizations are facing, regardless of the size that they are increasing in sophistication. I'm the Prince of Nigeria and I need you to, print this check for me and then I'll send you money back. Those days are gone. What we're seeing now with, fake calendar entries, and what you mentioned about, kind of that wave of attacks where they're just, playing to someone's psychology and, I'm just going to stop the noise and I'll accept the, this password reset because my gosh, this is driving me crazy. This has really become psychological warfare rather than just, hey, I'm trying to get into your computer systems. This is disruption at its finest.
Well, then the other thing we used to see is if they were going to break down your door, they were going to rob you immediately, right? That was the metaphor. Today, they want to get a foothold in your network and they may not be back for months. They want to research everything. They want to know everybody that works for you. They want to know the key players. They want to know how you communicate. So the threats are definitely way more sophisticated than they ever have been before. And remember, there's a lot of people that they can employ to do these that have nothing else to do. So their resources are far more vast than yours to protect yourself.
So everything that's on this slide, makes total sense. This is, kind of basic 101. Of course, I need to get my arms wrapped around, where my risk really is. Where's that data? What's valuable? What's important? What do I really rely on? And then ultimately that's going to define the backup strategy. And then, the planning on how we respond. But, with the customers you're starting with today, brand new engagements, how many of them have, and not trying to pin you down to a number, but, is it the majority, is it the minority that actually have, this first bullet point in place, the assessment, the backup, and the plan?
So you'll laugh. Most of them have the backup, and I would say 60 to 70% of them have it done correctly and they can recover. The assessment is the least likely of all of these. A lot of them have plans because they've been required to do so. Insurance has asked them, their ownership has asked them. There's been some reason, some driving factor. The assessment, they just kind of assume they know what they have, right? But they forget that there's been leadership changes, there's been advances in technologies, departments have added their own software. So the assessment is often the most lacking. And then the backup for the 30 to 40% that don't have it done correctly, they don't know that it's not correct, right? They set it up once and they assume it's working. So either there's nobody monitoring and managing it, or they've just added data and they've forgotten to, and oh, we set the backup up 2 years ago, but we bought a new payroll system 1 year ago. right? Key things like that are often overlooked. So you'll see as we talk about this, these 3 steps, it's really a cycle. We're going to go in a circle, right? We're starting doing these 3. We're going to implement multi-factor, and there's always going to be a new multi-factor. Multi-factor is the thing today. Tomorrow, there'll be a new thing that's the best thing we can do. So that's going to be recycled and replaced as we find new protections against these advanced threats.
And, as I continue to digest this, and, organizations and businesses alike, they ask us, my gosh, it's already hard enough for us to keep up with the demands of running our business and deal with the people issues. And now we have this, this onslaught of attacks. But this really isn't a hard departure from basic continuous improvement of any process, right? Plan, do, check, act. So this shouldn't be a hard sell for organizations. But, as I was researching this, something that was alarming to me was less than 20% of most businesses' IT spend has to do with cybersecurity.
Yeah.
Do you still see that as kind of an funded area of, this part of the process and planning?
It's a world of extremes these days, right? So we still have plenty of clients that think that this doesn't apply to them and their spend is minimal. They don't allocate any budget. They're just totally reactive. And then we've got others that have had a problem or have had a friend or another business that's had a problem, and they're putting a blank check out there saying we need to spend anything. And spending anything and everything isn't the right answer either. You need to allocate your budget intelligently, right? You need to find what are the biggest threats to my business, what are the most critical systems, how important is cyber, right? The more coverage you need, the better your systems and controls have to be. You mentioned that people aren't allowing you to get the same kind of coverages. You can often get them, but you've got to prove that you're doing something that you've earned their trust, that this isn't going to be a guaranteed loss. Because you're right, a lot of people are looking at it as, I'm just going to buy cyber for this low premium, and if something happens, I get paid. That's definitely, it isn't worth it. A lot of the businesses, a huge percentage, and I wanted to throw some statistics in here, and I gave up because they were so all over the board and you couldn't really trust anyone. What I do know is a large number of businesses that get hit don't recover, period, right? If they don't have these steps addressed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and FEMA actually, they benchmark it pretty high. If you can't open your doors and resume, basic operations within 5 days, 90% of those businesses close within a year. So, I mean, those are scary numbers, and they really are. And, we don't want, we certainly don't want people just to throw money at a problem, but there's a lot of confusion around, what a business can do and steps they can take. And naturally there's people who are trying to prey on their, their emotions and, give them a solution. Have you seen any of these, one kind of size fits all? Hey, if you put a FortiGate on your system, that's going to solve all your problems. Is there really a silver bullet for this, Lawrence, or is this part of a multifaceted plan?
It's absolutely multifaceted. There is no silver bullet. I mentioned that multi-factor is the best technical measure you can do. It's only part of a multi-pronged solution, right? And you mentioned the budget. We don't want to spend bad money. So we had a global organization with virtually unlimited budget, about 5,000 employees, that was just getting hit again and again with employee password breaches. They weren't getting to the heart of their network, but just annoying the heck out of them, driving them crazy and causing them risk and worry. So it didn't matter how much they spent. They bought 2 filters. They bought 3 firewalls. They just kept spending. And the biggest thing that they said made a difference was employee education. They implemented a security awareness training program, and their number of tickets that were associated with these events dropped by 87%. So it also isn't a silver bullet, but it is a big deal. And you'd be surprised at the people that just don't know that this is a threat. What do you mean I'm not supposed to send money to X person? But they asked for iTunes gift cards. I should send them, right?
Mm-hmm. And I've seen this firsthand. I was literally in the office with a prospective customer, and I'm talking to the CEO, and we're talking about cyber, and he said, that's baloney, right? That's baloney. Nobody falls for that type of stuff. The people I have know better. I mean, they said they know better. And, 25, 30 minutes go on, the conversation continues. We've moved past cyber. And sure enough, this person knocks on the door and puts an envelope on his desk and says, here you go, boss. Here's those gift cards that you asked for. And the guy's looking at him with this confused face. And he said, no, that email you sent about everyone needs to go out and buy the gift cards. I already sent the numbers in and everything. He did exactly what he wasn't supposed to do. And I mean, for me, it was hook, line, and sinker to set up the cyber discussion, because we were talking about, you don't know if you're vulnerable, right? You can't assume that you're not. And this happened to be somebody in the supply chain. This was a trucker. This was somebody who was on the transportation side, and they didn't really fully anticipate what the impact of their operations, even a small portion of them, a dispatch system, shutting down for an extended period of time would have on their operations. And after we kind of, went through the aha moments, it was a very, very different situation. So it almost feels like, this is a type of risk where people get burned before they, realize I can control this. I can do something to prevent this. And my question to you, Lawrence, is, the folks that have gone through the steps, they've assessed it, they've backed it up, and they've planned, they're still getting hit with the ransomware attacks. That doesn't stop. But are you seeing, the impact of those decrease?
Yes, not only that, but the impact is lessened, right? We had a potential client that ended up being our client after the event, but during our acquisition process of them, they got hit with ransomware over a holiday. They were doing things right. This happened on Memorial Day weekend. And on Friday at, I think, 7 p.m., they started to see the attack happen. And by Tuesday morning, 8 o'clock, everything was business as usual because they took all the right steps. They immediately isolated the systems. They disconnected them, they rolled back their backups, they identified the point of entry, closed it, started things back up, and the vast majority of their employees had no idea. Now, contrary to that, we have another global account that's 8,000 people worldwide, 22 countries, 57 locations. They are still recovering, and it's been over a year. They did recover, they got critical systems back up immediately, but their big saving grace was good backups for core systems and a plan. But they are still using a lot of the manual aspects of that plan. They are nowhere near top efficiency. So margins and profitability have all been affected for a significant amount of time.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that because, naturally this is an evolution. Most organizations just can't flip a switch. They don't have unlimited budget. They don't have unlimited personnel. They don't have a limited bandwidth. So they've got to, take incremental steps to ensuring that they improve and they get better. And I remember working with one customer, and it was over a course of 2 to 3 years, it was about business continuity planning. Cyber was a component, but it was really about business continuity planning and saying, at least get a plan in place. And they strung it along for a long time. And finally, they took steps to at least I'm talking a very baseline skeletal business continuity plan in place. And sure enough, a couple weeks go by and they got hit with a ransomware. Monday morning, they came back after a holiday weekend. And they've got the dreaded ransomware screen. And in this particular situation, it was a $1.4 million ransom demand. And they said, no way, we can't afford this. They don't have cyber coverage. They couldn't pay it. So they said, we're not going to do it. And they more or less had a scorched earth approach and had a backup from 2 weeks prior, because they at least had started doing bi-monthly backups, and ultimately had to recreate a bunch of data. They lost $160-some thousand in just expenses associated with data recreation. And, after a month, probably still weren't 100% up and running, but were able to get back to a somewhat steady pace. Since then, they've implemented a business continuity plan that, obviously looks at a number of other factors. But I'm hoping that, through the rest of our presentation today and what, you and I dig into, the message to our attendees is, don't wait. Even incremental steps that you take today can have a resounding impact on the cost of the claim, the duration of the claim, and ultimately how it plays into your business.
Absolutely. Yeah, so we can dive in a little bit into the assessment. People underestimate how important this is, but think about if your house burns down and you don't have some kind of inventory of the contents. How are you going to make that claim work? The insurance company is going to guess, you're going to guess, often you're going to say that isn't enough, they're going to say it's too much, however. So your computer systems are similar. You have to identify what's critical to your business, and more importantly, reduce the amount of attack vectors, right? If you purchase some kind of software that never took off, but still sitting out on your network, never updated, kind of orphaned, or the famous one, we see this all the time. Somebody's using a key system. Let's pick on Microsoft and say it's their Dynamics product, and then they move away to another system. Well, we want to keep Dynamics around because we have some historical data and we're going to look at that. So that's great, but who's going to update that? If you're not going to keep that updated and managed, it has to be decommissioned and removed from the network. If you need that data, export it, print reports, that kind of thing. This extends to hardware. Think about the hospitals, right? That we see them in the news all the time. They're the ones, I feel bad for them. Every time they get hit, they're in the news, right? Doesn't matter whether they're tiny or they're huge. So the main reason the hospitals get hit is actually the main reason. There are two main reasons: the size of their networks. They usually have large networks, even the smallest hospital, and then their equipment. They bought an MRI machine 10 years ago. Nobody wants to pay $2 million to update that to Windows 10 or whatever the latest version is. It's running fine. Why should we change it? That thought process doesn't work anymore. So getting rid of old things is paramount, and you need to know they exist to get rid of them, hence the assessment. Data locations. Moving data to the cloud is kind of like multi-factor. It's better in the cloud than it is on premise. There are more resources protecting it. And I say that with a caveat. If your cloud provider is a significant one, Amazon, Google, Microsoft, whomever, yes, there are significant security measures and teams protecting it. If your cloud provider is a vendor you've used for the last 15 years that is hosting this out of a closet in their office, that's not the same thing. So all clouds are not equal. Workstations. When was the last time you had somebody say, hey, we're giving you a new laptop? You said, well, let me hold on to the old one. No, get rid of it. This is true life cycle. We need to get rid of those. The last one on here is authentication methods. How are you accessing data? Do you remember one of the systems you've logged into recently that says you can't have more than 8 characters? You can't have special characters? Like on one hand, we're being told we have to have these complex passwords, and on another, we have old systems that don't allow it. So let's make sure any vendor that's requiring less than acceptable standards, they need to be put on notice. We're going to find a new vendor because we can't afford to risk our business.
Mm-hmm. With the work you guys do in the assessment phase, do you find that there's oftentimes, unprotected destinations, network folders, things that, even from an HR or, just a personnel management side of the house that are risk factors, bad practice because they lack the security controls?
Absolutely. The principle of least access, right? Least privileged access is not often followed. So with the advent of Dropbox, SharePoint, all of these cloud systems, a lot of the burden of creating these shares has gone from IT to departments and individuals, and they're not always up on the security controls. So I'm going to share this with everyone so that I don't get any calls saying I can't access anything when it should have only been shared with the finance department. So all of those affect the ability to secure and properly deal with an environment. If your environment is wide open, ransomware can move across the entire thing, wipe out everything. If your environment is separated, segregated, segmented, whatever the term you want to use, then at least it's going to be limited in the amount of damage it can do.
So one of the pushbacks we get is, obviously the pace of business. Hey, this takes so long for me to do. When you really distill this down, Lawrence, how long is an assessment, for an organization? And naturally, I know the number of endpoints and complexity play into it. But let's just assume an average Western Pennsylvania business, kind of start to finish to go through an assessment. What's the time commitment?
To go through an assessment process obviously depends on the size of the client, but it's almost always less than a week. And for most people, it's less than a day of actual interaction with somebody, right? That's somebody looking at your systems, getting administrative passwords to scan your network, that type of thing. And oftentimes it's even less than 4 hours. We have a lot of automated tools. And that goes back to your question of how do you do this? How do you even get started? It's simple. It's like anything else. You can create an Excel sheet that lists every workstation you have, every piece of software. If you know those things, that's absolutely acceptable. If you're a larger organization and you don't have anywhere to start, the person that did them 5 years ago is gone, there are automated systems that we can use today to gather that information. So not only tell what you have, but when was the last time it was used? Which is a good question, right? Going back to those derelict systems and orphaned controls.
Mm-hmm. And this has been an eye-opening experience. We've seen a number of customers who've completed their application, based on what they had last year. They had no one from, an IT lens really filling out the application. The typical insurance buyer did it. And the old applications, that was fine because the questions are relatively, vanilla, non-invasive. But, through these assessment processes, we've seen that, where one organization said we have 100 endpoints, and then IT gets involved, they have 10,000 endpoints. This plays into that question of, I don't want to pay more for insurance than I have to, but this is really about truing up what your risk exposure is. What do you have that needs protected? Let's match your insurance program based off of the true snapshot of what your organization looks like. And we view these assessments as twofold. One, it's a discovery. It's going to tell us a lot about the organization and where there are potential risk factors. But this is also a checkup where you can improve your own cyber hygiene And we find that a lot of organizations, when they do get into a data breach scenario or someone has encrypted their data and they have this voluminous amount of information, oftentimes they didn't really even need all of it. They were hanging on to legacy records. They were hanging on to things, especially that now could become used against you, right? These are essentially, currency in the hostage negotiation of, we have your data. So through these processes, you could actually kind of clean up your own, hygiene as a cyber customer and improve your risk profile.
Yeah, and positive things come out of this. This isn't just here to scare you and say that the world is ending, there's nothing you can do. By going through the assessment process, you can identify things that you no longer need to pay for. Think hoarders. We have a storage unit full of crap. And, like you said, it can become currency if we don't know what it is or how important it is. Mm-hmm. So simply going through this process and identifying what is critical to the business and what is not. We found clients that have 100 users, but have 87 servers. It's almost a server for every employee. Do we think that's necessary? Right? And it obviously isn't unless you're some kind of software developer. So there are lots of cases where people, even amongst workstations, they'll say, hey, we have 40 employees and we have 80 computers. How is that possible? There's always going to be a few extra for conference rooms, old machines, whatever, but it definitely shouldn't be 2 to 1.
So if I'm hearing you, it's almost that even through the course of just regular business, you could almost create, additional risk factors, because as you scale and grow, it becomes more difficult to keep your arms wrapped around even just the physical assets of what you have.
Absolutely. And the gold standard for these assessments is some kind of automated platform that's reporting when devices are new, when they're stale. And that takes a lot of the labor and makes this a lot less intensive, right? This process is a quick review when you get to renew your cyber or when you want to go through your IT.
And what's the recommended interval for this, Lawrence? Is this kind of a one and done, hey, I do that assessment initially and I never have to do it again? Or does this become part of an annual kind of maintenance program?
Annual at a minimum. In today's world, it's probably quarterly, and it should be able to be generated on demand. This is almost like managing your inventory these days, right?
So is this similar to what, some of our insureds have seen reports called a bit site report? And it's essentially a third-party scan. It's telling them a little bit of information about their systems. Is that the type of, quarterly scan that, that the insureds could look for, or is there something more in-depth and more effective?
There's both, and the in-depth and more effective is where I would go with this. Systems to at least do a baseline inventory of your workstation servers and network assets are very inexpensive, and they provide great value because you could ask at any time. It's Thursday at 1 o'clock. I want to know how many workstations have been active in the last 30 days. Mm-hmm. That's going to give you that number anytime you need it. And it's also, if we see a strange amount of activity on your network, now I can correlate it to, oh, you've added 10 devices. Where are they? Right?
Mm-hmm. And this is becoming a tool that we see on the insurance side where, they're using this as a preemptive survey to really know and get a pulse of, who am I going to insure? But it's as an ongoing tool meant to be a resource that customers use to, again, stay diligent and proactive on keeping, those threat actors out of their systems.
Well, it started with patch management, right? They wanted us to have centralized patch management. We no longer can turn on automatic updates and expect that that's just going to take care of it. We need to know what patches were available, were they installed, when was the last time it was checked, all of those things. So all of that is trickling down to systems that tell us more about the network and give us a more accurate picture on a regular basis.
So this is really about tightening up, the individual risk profile of every single customer we're working with. There is no one size fits all solution.
Not at all. Each one is custom. Each client has unique needs, right? And this one, backups are the difference between paying a ransom or experiencing a loss, period. Mm-hmm. If you don't have backups, you are going to lose data no matter what. There's a large percentage of the time that you pay the ransom and you either get nothing or you only get a portion of your data back. So that's not even, it used to be that they offered good customer service for ransomware, right? That, like all customer service, is struggling these days. So, but the key to backups, there's a really simple rule that you'll see all over the internet and has been kind of the gold standard forever. It's a 3-2-1 rule. We have to apply it a little differently with cloud, but you need 3 copies of your data. You need it in 2 different media formats. Now I added here, or different clouds. So if your primary cloud provider is Amazon, you should be backing up that cloud to Microsoft or Google or a private data center. So make sure you take your cloud storage and cloud products into account when you're thinking about this rule. And then the one copy offsite, obviously that gets reversed if your data is in the cloud. You know, when I first started in the business, the biggest thing we sold was offsite backups. And now, of course, we preach to people, you need an on-site backup of your cloud data. What happens if your cloud provider, they're probably not going to go belly up because most of us are using major providers, but they don't even know who you are. So the likelihood of something going wrong, while not high, it still happens, and your ability to recover, it's on you. It's not on them. I'd like to see you try to call Satya Nadella or one of the Google guys and say, hey, I lost some data. Can you help me out? So make sure you take that seriously. And then I spoke about this one a little earlier. This one's a new buzzword. We used to call it read only. If you set a file to read only, it could no longer be changed. So now it's immutable storage. This just means that those backups can't be changed or deleted. And it's a marketing term that is directly related to ransomware, but that doesn't make it not true. It is critically important that your backups be air-gapped or based on immutable storage. One copy replicated each night to 3 different locations, that doesn't count in this scenario. You need to take that aspect very seriously. A lot of people said, oh, we have great backups. You know, hey, we had the ransomware, can you help us restore? Here's our backup. And we open it up and we say, well, your backup is encrypted too. Well, that's the only backup I have. Well, so
if you know, they take, you know, a customer takes the steps and they shift their focus towards the immutable storage, does that eliminate the threat of that backup getting encrypted?
It does currently. Tomorrow that may change, but currently that eliminates the threat of the backup being encrypted.
Interesting. So, you know, in itself, there's really, again, this is about diligence. It's about making sure that, you know, you're consistent with the backing up of your data on a program schedule, keeping it going in, you know, multiple, you know, repositories. So all of our eggs aren't in one basket, so to speak. And you know, that offsite backup. And I'm glad you brought that up because I remember working with an organization that was going through, it wasn't a cyber event, but it happened to be, you know, it was an emergency in their building, it was a weather disaster, and they couldn't get into their location. And I said, all right, well, we need to be able to get to your customers, right? You got to notify your customers. Where's the customer list? Well, it's on the computer system at the location. And this is predating, you know, remote access and things like that. There was VPN, but not to any degree that people were storing data that way. And as a result of it, there was like a 2-day gap where customers weren't able to get notified. They rallied people who had basic customer information in their cell phones. But, you know, for lack of anything, they were scrambling. They were truly scrambling. So, you know, that offsite copy, Lawrence, I can't impress upon our attendees enough that when we're thinking about this, understand that you may lose access to the common places that you go. And part of an effective backup is knowing that, you know, offsite somewhere else, completely separate from the location that we're at, we know we can gain access to something like this. So whether we have a printed copy of our incident response plan, you know, with your managed service provider's number, your key IT person, you know, risk, insurance, your cyber liability insurance provider, claim number. I remember having, you know, paper documents of my business continuity plan in my vehicle, in my home, and at my office. Is this the same type of approach here where, you know, kind of depositing a couple of these in different places, you know, prevents full-scale data loss?
Absolutely. Yeah. No, there's no better methodology than having things in multiple locations, whether it's multiple clouds, whether it's on-premise and in the cloud. It doesn't matter what works for you, but you need to do something. And a lot of people just are only doing part of it today. So take that last step, you're 90% there, and make this something you can recover from quickly, right?
And so naturally, we don't want to ever, you know, increase the difficulty or complexity for, you know, our customers to respond. Does it make it more difficult to kind of have, you know, 3 little, you know, safety backups spread out? Is that become more complex to secure, or is it all still the same methodology?
No, this part has actually become easier. All of the major players have some term they use, orchestrator, configurator, whatever they want to call it, that you just define a policy for how your backups are going to work, and they follow that policy. Now, it's important that you follow up and check, but as long as someone is making sure the switches are being flipped and the data is being moved, then you're usually in good shape without any more work than it was to do one place. It's just a matter of setting it up correctly to begin with, right? Start with a solid foundation.
Excellent.
Yeah, and we talked about this one. I said, it doesn't matter whether it's disaster recovery, business continuity, incident response, you have to have a plan. And think about the things that are most likely to happen, right? We still have fire drills all the time in buildings, in schools. These days, what's more likely, a fire drill or a cyber attack, right? Mm-hmm. Or so let's make sure we're planning for the event that's going to happen. So your first plan that you come up with probably should be a physical one, but that one should be a little easier because we're already a lot of cloud usage. So that takes care of that. Mm-hmm. Your next one should be a ransomware event. And then after that is a data breach, but let's make sure you have a plan. If you're trying to manage this in the middle of the crisis, it's going to be that much harder.
Now, whenever I work with a customer and we dig into their risk, we want to test it naturally. We always want to test it. Is there a way to almost create a simulated breach event or a simulated ransomware event that it can test an organization of how they respond? And the reason I ask that, Lawrence, is this is a perfect example with the evacuation map. When I'm really kind of digging in and getting a pulse on an organization to see how they look at risk and how deep they've gone to educate their employees and really ingrain it in the way that they do business. I always hold an evacuation drill, right? And I block the primary evacuation route. And they're meant now to go to their secondary. They were always supposed to be trained on their secondary. They were always supposed to know that, but we see the evacuation times increase dramatically, as well as people congregating and clustering and almost bottlenecking of they don't know where to go. And so they don't revert back to the plan. This is one of those areas where you can't just develop the plan, set it on the shelf and say, we'll use it whenever we need it. This is something that needs to be tested and drilled with your team, because the way that the attack happens, the way that the ransomware event or the way that the disruption is going to occur may honestly be a way that hasn't been anticipated or not the typical vector that we would see. Do you agree that this is something that needs drilled on and worked on more than just once a year?
Absolutely. And we talked about security awareness training for employees. I believe part of that should be the disaster recovery plan, the human element of it. What do our people actually have to do? What's their responsibility in an incident? Mm-hmm. The more they do it, it's going to become muscle memory, right? Right now, it's just this thing we talk about. So if they've never had an exercise to go through it, they just don't know how to respond. And you've got a variety of ways to do that, from tabletop exercises where you just have a meeting and talk about what happens, to an actual simulated event run by your organization, to you can hire third parties that will do a full team that does exactly what you're saying. They might block an exit, they might unplug a server, they may lock out 10 people from their computer, take the phones down, any one of the above to help drive that point home that you need to follow the plan. And if the first thing doesn't work, go to your backup, right? There's always multiple ways to handle any incident.
Mm-hmm. And we're talking about a lot of things that require time, attention, budget, for organizations to take on. And I want to again validate the importance of this and impress upon you guys with just another quick statistic that we saw in the first 6 months of 2021 about $590 million get paid out in ransomware. Okay, that compares to all of 2020, 416 million was paid out. So in half of 2021. We saw an over 100% increase in what was already paid out the year before. And we're on pace to crush that again. So, these exercises of, putting together the plan and then drilling through the plan and, getting that muscle memory in place could have a dramatic impact on how long you would be down in the event that you do have a ransomware event, which is going to affect your claim cost and obviously, how well you survive. But again, position you to be anticipating what can happen and switch the kind of DNA of the organization over to active detection, proactivity versus it's not going to happen to us, or if it does, that's why we got cyber insurance.
Well, and the old thing is an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, right? That's definitely the case here. The amount of money you will spend implementing this plan, doing proper backups, educating your team is far less than you will spend and have a far greater result.
Yes, very true. And I find that many organizations have no idea what it will cost them to recover. And they're making, an assumption on, it's too expensive to implement, or I don't have a budget to do that. They have no concept of the impact of, the cost of those claims.
Well, in this particular topic, I'll give you some good news. 99% of you use a platform that includes multi-factor authentication in its cost, whether it's Google or 365. both include that in every product they use for email. So if you're not using it today, shame on you. You're not only leaving the door unlocked, you're leaving it wide open if you're not taking advantage of the multi-factor authentication. So, and just a quick summary of what it is. Right now, you log in with a username and password, right? That's what we've been using for years. This adds a third aspect to this, hence the multi. So it's something you have, and it's either going to be something on your mobile device with an app, or it's going to be a key, or it's going to be that text message. Why is it so important? Because it's something they can't get electronically and they can't get en masse. So if somebody is targeting a particular individual, they may be able to find a way around it, but at least they're not going to find a way around it for all of your employees at exactly the same time. Before, they could steal 200 passwords or 2,000 passwords, and it was the same. Multi-factor, if they're attacking that, is much more difficult to attack en masse. So as I mentioned, email, it's absolutely necessary. There's no other option at this point. If you don't have it, you need to get it. And that's just the way it is. Mm-hmm. Remote access, if you're offering VPN, Citrix, AnyDesk, any of those type of technologies, any remote access needs to be protected by that. You can often double up here. If you're using Microsoft technology, one system of authentication can cover multiple things. The same one you use for email can cover your remote access. So we talk about that balance of usability and security. We want that to be pretty even. I don't want to make it so tough that our users won't do it, right? And that applies to every user, whether they're a trucker, whether they're an executive. It's still painful to implement all these things that we never had to do before, right? So yeah. Core applications are the last one. You're going to struggle with this one because a lot of core applications are just getting around to adding it. The big boys have it for sure, but if you've got a vertical industry that has a niche player, they may not have it yet. You need to demand that they get it, or at least integrate with other systems that use it.
So when we kind of distill this all down and bring it back to the point we made earlier, that about 80% of email compromise is a result of weak or stolen passwords. In essence, even if they have my password, but they don't have the approval from the multi-factor authentication, they're not getting into the system.
Correct.
So this is really almost the best thing that we could say is going to attack the human error part of the weak link in the cybersecurity chain.
When you talk about reviewing what we do, how we do it, trying to be more proficient, more efficient, save money, save time, reduce risk, this is it. This will have the biggest impact on your organization. This will offer you the easiest way to lower your risk out of all the things we've talked about.
And this is something we mentioned as a table stake. I mean, there is still cyber insurance out there for companies that don't have multi-factor authentication, but it comes at a premium on your premium because of the risk factors that come along with it. And just that this is that initial, think about a deadbolt on your door versus just a standard lock. The dramatic increase in security for that. And that's essentially what we're asking. And if I heard you correctly, Lawrence, most people who are using Microsoft or Google, this is already an embedded component and wouldn't be an additional cost?
That is correct. Yeah, so there's no excuse for you not to have this today.
That's pretty compelling. And it really is. And we've seen organizations struggle with it. What's the typical investment of time? In this case, it's great news that it may not cost anything additionally from a budget standpoint, but from a time, realistically, what does an organization need to anticipate this takes to implement?
So it really depends on the number of employees and how spread out they are. But most organizations can fully implement multi-factor in less than a week. It's really simple and it's really easy to do. The biggest thing that we see pushback on is employees not wanting to put an app on their phone. So if you have all employer-owned devices, you can cut that time dramatically. If you have a bunch of BYOD or bring your own devices, you're going to have a little bit more time because you need to communicate to your employees that this in no way infringes on their privacy. This application does not give you any capabilities on their devices. All it is extra security. And there are ways around it. If you have employees that don't want to put an app on their phone, all the major players offer some way around it. Some of those may add a cost, but it's an easy way for us to take care of employees that don't want to put an app on, right? It can do a phone call or you can do some kind of bypass code instead. So multi-factor works for all organizations. There is no excuse that says we can't do this because, right? You can't say, well, my employees won't do that. Well, if they won't do this, they probably shouldn't be an employee because you need to have this at this point.
Mm-hmm. You brought up an interesting point about, the bring your own device. In the world we're in right now, where, clearly remote capabilities and, being able to work from anywhere in the world, naturally that has to increase the attack surface. These bad actors can get, multiple bites at the apple because they've got all these other users. Do those personal devices, increase the risk factor for that organization? Or by just having, again, this implemented, is that enough of a safety net that it protects them?
There's always more that can be done, right? There is no silver bullet, but this is the best safety net you can use today. Good.
So that's been, the hotly debated topic of, why am I going to do this if it's going to be obsolete? Why do I have to do this? I didn't have to do it last year. And, we're naturally we're required to do it. If you want coverage, if you want to be able to get, the quote from that insurance carrier, we have to jump through the hoops that they have there. And those hoops are there for good reason. But just to, put a bow on this conversation, because this is quite honestly one of the biggest areas of misconception that we get calls on, as well as, pushback. Not an expensive process because it's most likely included in what you're already doing. Really less than a week of potential disruption, not even disruption, but, implementation to the organization, and essentially provides a really highly effective net to, cover at least a good portion of business email compromise risk.
Correct. Those points are all correct. And the last one you said, hey, we didn't have to do this last year, right? One thing to remember is old threats don't go away. We see people that are infected with problems, ransomware, whatever, from 4 or 5 years ago that we thought were dead. So you can't, if MFA is our thing that stops it today, it's going to continue to protect you tomorrow. There may be less threats, but they are still out there. So each time we layer on a new security thing, you're very rarely getting rid of an old one, right? You're usually building upon that foundation of best practices. And some of these things, we should have been doing these all along, but technology has been moving fast. We didn't always think security first. Today's world has changed that.
Very true. That is very true. So on the awareness training, Lawrence, you mentioned about, this isn't a checkbox, this is an active part of what we're doing. What's the best approach here? I know there's a number of providers out there, whether it's KnowBe4 or Sophos, or, how do you make heads or tails of what to do? And if you could just, kind of give an example of, what this really looks like for an organization.
Yeah, it doesn't matter which one you use. They are all good. Whether it is Sophos, whether it is KnowBe4, every one of those programs will be effective, right? It's kind of similar to a diet. But this is something you need to review and do regularly. So staying informed and aware is going to mean paying attention to the news. What's the latest breach? There's a handout that comes along with this that will give you some resources you can go to. Sophos has a great blog. Fortinet has one, and there are several others out there. The other thing is this isn't a one-man thing. Leverage a team. If you need help, find it. It's out there. Whether it's your insurance broker, whether it's your managed service provider, whether it's a managed security firm or a penetration tester, there's somebody that can help you improve your cyber resilience, right? And your folks may not have the bandwidth to do this, may not have the experience, or may not have the desire. They got into IT to help make sure the printers print, the networks can communicate, things like that. They didn't necessarily want to know about ransomware and phishing and all of this fun stuff that we have to deal with today. Dovetailing into that, we all thought we were buying firewalls and this problem would go away, right? If you talked to somebody 10 years ago, that was the thing. We bought a firewall, we are protected. Well, where are your employees today and where is your firewall is the question. So obviously a lot of us have remote employees and we may have spent a lot of money on a firewall that is in our office that does nothing to protect those remote employees unless the network has been engineered specifically to do so. So you may not need to spend any more money on anything. You just may need to rethink the way your systems work. Everything doesn't increase a cost. Hopefully there's some things you can take away from this that will actually lower your risk and not cost you anything additional. And again, we can't look at the weather and say, what's it going to be like next month? That's the best analogy I can give you here for security. We have to look at this every day and say, do I have any new risks that I have to address today? Someone in your organization has to be responsible for that.
And who do you find is typically that henchman, that person who gets this thrown on them in the organization? Because not every business has a full-time IT professional. So, where does this typically fall?
So it usually falls on finance. Finance is where it all rolls up to, right? IT usually reports to finance, but they usually delegate it. There's a director of IT, there's a chief technology, whatever the title, there's someone inside the organization that's ultimately responsible. But we're finding most of those people are augmenting their capabilities by using third parties, whether that's a managed security firm, whether that's just a managed service provider that also adds security services. But if you're not specifically talking about security with your IT partners today, you need to be. That probably should be 50% of your communication should be about that versus just infrastructure, new servers, new computers, security first, everything else next.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's a really common misconception, Lawrence, is that IT is cybersecurity. And the two are, parallel paths, but are not necessarily the same discipline.
Right. And you may have an individual or a number of individuals in your team that do take care of those things, but it was not the norm a few years ago. So unless they're staying up on current events, that's not likely.
Mm-hmm. Well, just like our response has to evolve, the way that we, complete our applications and the way that we go out there and procure cyber insurance certainly has to evolve as well. And more than any other application, this really needs to be a multidisciplinary approach. And I mentioned earlier about, IT getting involved and the number of endpoints on the application changed, dramatically. And, this also encompasses HR and risk because, as we mentioned about, cybersecurity awareness training, this becomes a critical part of your employees, as well as, personal device policies, and using that piece of, company issued equipment and the purposes that they're using it for. So it really becomes important to have a 360-degree view around the controls you have in place, not just what IT and cybersecurity are saying, but risk management and HR, because that will give a comprehensive view of what your organization looks like. And if you think about your insurance application, it really comes out looking like a puzzle piece, right? It's a box of pieces that underwriter is assembling to get a more accurate picture of what you look like, and is this something I really want to pursue and become involved with? So it's important to complete this as thoroughly as possible, and by all means lean on us. There's a lot of terminology and questions on these applications now that have changed, and it's supplemental applications that could be 5 to 12 pages long, and they could be daunting, and know that you're not alone. For many of our customers that already have cyber insurance, there's a host of resources that are available to you that could improve your position today to get a better price down the road. And some of these come in the form of pre-breach services. These could be those network scans that Lawrence had mentioned. These could be breach coaches that proactively would put you through kind of a tabletop audit and say, all right, this is what happened. What would be affected? What would take, how long would it take to get this back up and running? So on and so forth, and help you run through some of those scenarios, as well as augment any of the areas that you may be deficient. And if you've experienced a ransomware event before, understand that you are going to be under a full investigation to the extent of what you've done to mitigate that risk from happening again. And I'll give you an example of a client that I worked with in a past life that had a ransomware event and decided not to engage their third-party cybersecurity group, decided not to work through the insurance carrier because they didn't want to trigger the deductible, and they thought we can handle this in-house. And they lost email access for a few days. They were still able to get some phone messages going back and forth, but long and short, they thought they were through with it. And their internal IT person had forgotten to delete the malware off of one computer out of a recycle bin, and the whole thing started again. And it just compounded the effects of it. So, the way that organizations respond really set them up for the future, and know that just like if we had a major medical event, we wouldn't want to try to treat this in-house. We would want to discuss this with experts. And in order for us to get the best coverage, it really helps to ensure that we've had someone who has expertise in this, validate what we're doing. And of all the questions you're going to see on an application, this one probably has the most resounding impact on how an underwriter is going to look at you from, are you prepared? And it's the simple question of, based upon testing, how long did it take to restore your critical operations? And if you don't know, that paints a very vivid picture of, this is someone who is unprepared for the crisis that's going to ensue. So the simple act of testing and at least getting a ballpark idea of, hey, this is what it's going to take us, just narrows what you need as a customer and can help us improve your position. So as we close out, I want to ask one more pop quiz. And for the folks that are still with us, what's the average recovery time for a business after they experience a ransomware event? Let a couple of those come in. So we are grossly under anticipating this. I'm seeing 3 days, 2 days. It is on average 23 days, a little over 3 weeks. That is a long time if you're blind, if you can't see your information, if you can't access critical data, if you can't, reach out and get customer information. Maybe it's your drawings, maybe it's access to other information, maybe it's medical records. Regardless of what that is, what is that acceptable time frame? So as we close this out, your policy isn't enough. Cyber liability is not just a lever you can pull and it's a silver bullet to restore your organization. You need to have a business continuity plan, and you need to have a resilience measure in there to test that plan and make sure it's going to work. And at a minimum, we need to think what can happen. And we have to plan comprehensively. We have to think of all the attack vectors, all the ways that our business could be impacted, not just computers and cyber, but weather, active shooter, a number of scenarios. And then how will your business be affected? How far could this reach? We're seeing an increase in the number of physical impacts, whether it's process machinery, maybe it's emergency lighting, maybe it's surveillance systems, but we're seeing physical components of organizations being affected as well. And we can plan for that. We need to figure out how we're going to effectively communicate both internally with our staff and personnel, as well as externally, that crisis communication. And what to do through this myriad of crises, because oftentimes they can happen simultaneously. We saw that with civil unrest and people attacking computer systems of organizations. How to recover from that event, a detailed plan, and then the potential cost to the organization to prevent versus ignore. In the beginning of 2020, less than 50% of organizations had a business continuity plan. And despite the pandemic, there's still a staggering amount that don't have that. And they simply don't know what the impact is. So as we, work to help you prepare, it's relatively easy to get started. Ready.gov, the FEMA planning website has a great business continuity tool plan to get you started and give you a framework. And I want to leave you with these 3 questions as you contemplate, how can I improve my resilience? How can I better position myself to get, improved cyber coverage? And ultimately, how do I just make sure that my business doesn't shut down permanently? I want you to really reflect on these 3 things. What is your cost per hour for downtime? In almost every insurance policy, there's a waiting period for business interruption, on average 8 to 12 hours. So let's just start at 8 hours. What is that cost going to be? And I hear many organizations say it's too expensive. It's going to cost me too much money. What's your cost per hour for downtime? And then we can establish if it's going to actually cost you more money. And there's ways that we can figure that out through a business impact analysis, and that ready.gov can help us with that. How long will it take your operations to restore? I talked to an individual who said, I got a great business continuity plan from a peer of mine. Well, that's like you wearing your dad's suit, right? Does it fit? Maybe, but it probably doesn't work like it should. It doesn't look like it was meant for you. This is just like that tailored suit. It's fitted for your organization. So we need to make sure we test this for our specifics. Remember, 23 days. That's a long time. And that statistic before from FEMA was 90% of businesses that don't reopen within 5 days are closed within a year. And so that last question I ask is, what are you waiting for? Are you waiting for tomorrow when you walk into the business and you turn on your computer and this is what it says? Or do you realize this is a threat I'm facing right now, and tomorrow, this afternoon, everything could change forever? I strongly encourage you to reach out within your network. Find that managed service provider, that trusted cybersecurity friend to the organization, and dig in. This is by and large one of the quickest ways for your business to go under and to see massive disruption and reputational loss. Take advantage of resources that are available to you and get ahead of it, because it will happen. So, any questions? I know we're up against our time. If you want to write them in the chat, we can certainly respond that way. Naturally, our contact information, you can openly, send us questions. We'll make this presentation available, as well as, backup sheet to help cover those 3 things that you can do from Lawrence's position that will improve your resilience in a ransomware scenario. And naturally, don't hesitate to reach out. We appreciate the time that you spent with us today. Lawrence, is there anything you wanted to add to close it out?
Yeah, I think we've kind of nailed it. There's 3 simple things you can do that are going to help. The one question about requiring employees to have MFA. So it all depends on your employee handbook, whether you can require them to or not. What you can do is tell them that this in no way gives you any rights to their device. This is just like giving a key to them, right? That application is the key to your systems.
Mm-hmm. And that awareness is important, because if our employees don't understand the intent of what we're doing, they can't help support the proactive nature that we're doing it for. So we really need to have them understand why we're doing it and have them as part of the solution and not as part of the exception to the rule.
Correct. And Joe and I are here to answer any questions anytime on any of these things.
Well, excellent. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and we'll be in touch. Stay safe and maintain a sense of vulnerability. Thank you.
Thank you.